I like that magpie out there, don't you? I think that magpie needs to show some restraint. Power. We all depend on it, don't we? Power gives us electricity and fuel and the various forms of energy we need to live in this 21st century. Power makes life-saving surgeries possible, and without displays of power, how much fun would it be to watch football, basketball, or even gymnastics? If we had no power, I'd have to handwrite my sermons, meaning that they would be completely illegible when I stood up here. And power enables us to travel and see the world, cross vast expanses of ocean relatively quickly, and birth our babies comparatively safely. And history has also shown us that power can be used very well by the right people in the right place at the right time for the benefit of humanity. Yes, power is a very good thing, and I believe it's God-given. Now, power in a variety of places is defined as the ability to act or to produce an effect. Others define power as physical might, mental or moral efficacy, or political control or influence. Some note that power means a source of energy or even the probability of rejecting a null hypothesis. And even without noting the variety of definitions of power, most of us know and understand power either because we exude it or because we are under the influence of it. But we all understand all too well, don't we, that power can be and is often misused, sometimes in horrific ways, such as spousal and sexual abuse, child abuse, human trafficking, or withholding life-saving drugs because of economics. And power over the course of history has been harnessed by true nut jobs with unspeakable consequences. Stalin, Hitler, and what's his name with that ridiculous haircut in North Korea come to my mind. As do white nationalists and neo-Nazis and other like-minded people. This is probably why Abraham Lincoln once said, and I think it's brilliant, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. I recently came across something I'd never heard of before, and once I heard it in the last week or so, I began to study this, both in secular literature, but also in scientific journals. And here's a smattering of what I found, both in secular journals and in scientific journals. And I quote, here's a series of quotes, just snippets out of these various sources. Researchers have found that CEOs and other leaders may suffer damage to their brain as a result of their rise to power. The damage results in the loss of the ability to read other people's emotions, which could explain why people who achieve great power lose their ability to feel empathy for the less powerful. One study showed that the areas of the brain that deal with empathy were significantly less responsive when examined in people in positions of power. A researcher, after 2 decades of study at the University of California, found that subjects under the influence of power acted as if they had suffered a traumatic brain injury, becoming more impulsive, less risk-aware, and crucially, less adept at seeing things from other people's points of view. And I still quote, "There's something called the hubris syndrome. The hubris syndrome is a disorder of the possession of power, particularly power which has been associated with overwhelming success, held for a period of years, and with minimal constraint on the leader. Hubris syndrome has 14 clinical features, including manifest contempt for others, loss of contact with reality, reckless actions, and displays of incompetence." And there's a boatload of research that is in there. I never heard of it before, but it's fascinating. And the good news is that not everyone, obviously, in positions of power experience these effects on the brain. And some studies show that there are steps that can be taken to ameliorate these clinical features. It's also true, and I quote, that power can be adaptive. Power primes our brain to screen out peripheral information, provides an energy boost. So this can be useful and adaptive, obviously, for a leader who is dealing with a major crisis, because they can strain out extraneous stuff and just focus on what they need to focus on. Yet they still have some of the effects I've mentioned earlier. A case in point. One article notes that Winston Churchill's wife, during the height of World War II, when things were really bad, wrote a note to him. Her note to her husband said, Winston, I've noticed a deterioration in your manner, and you're not as kind as you used to be. But while there's a lot more I could get into, I find this stuff all really fascinating, not only because I believe it to be true, and not only because I think scientists are onto something, but because this idea of the hubris syndrome can actually be found throughout Scripture. It's really interesting if you think about it. And although there are many stories in Scripture of people exercising power for the common good, like when Nehemiah managed the rebuilding of the temple wall in Jerusalem for the common good, which was a brilliant use of power, or when King Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, a brilliant use of power. There are many, many, many stories of people using power in Scripture in magnificent, wonderful ways. But we also know there are a boatload of stories of leaders using their power in very toxic ways. How about this example of the hubris syndrome? King David falls in love with somebody else's wife. So he has the guy killed. So he can have his wife. Or talk about the religious people in positions of power who use their power to stone Stephen to death. Or how about religious leaders who use their power to facilitate the crucifixion of Jesus? From beginning to end, the Bible, is a story about power, both good and bad. God's good power and the human use of power, sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. Now this morning I'd like to turn to a story that's full of nuances about power and what power did when it was used, and what happened when the power was, more importantly, restrained. Now many of us know the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. And I want to pick up the story in chapter 37 of Genesis, and I want to give you a quick summary of the story of the book of Genesis. You may remember that Joseph was born to a fellow named Jacob. Jacob had lots of wives. One of his wives was named Rachel. Jacob and Rachel have a son named Joseph, and Joseph was Jacob's favorite son among the 12 brothers. We know the story of Jacob giving Joseph a beautiful multicolored coat one day. Makes his brothers furious. They're filled with jealousy. And their jealousy eventually turns to hatred when Joseph tells his brothers about two dreams, both of which suggest, according to Joseph, that his brothers should bow down to him. And one day his brothers were out tending a flock of sheep, and Joseph, at his father's request, traveled to check on them. And when the brothers saw him coming, they plotted to kill him and throw him down a large cistern. But the brother Reuben, however, convinced them to do otherwise. And soon thereafter, a traveling caravan arrived, and the brothers sold Joseph off as a slave. From there, as you may remember, Joseph was taken to Egypt, and shortly thereafter, he finds favor with one of Pharaoh's assistants. Things go well for a while until Pharaoh's assistant's wife makes advances on Joseph, which Joseph refuses. And in retribution for his refusal, the wife falsely accuses Joseph. He ends up in the slammer for more than 2 years. And it's fascinating at this point. You can see power being used and misused by all kinds of people. Well, after a series of events, Joseph is eventually brought to Pharaoh to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And Joseph tells Pharaoh that the dreams mean that 7 years of prosperity would be followed by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh acts on Joseph's accurate interpretation and therefore makes it through a very difficult time successfully. You may remember, too, that Pharaoh appointed Joseph to the highest position of government. And when the famine spread out beyond Egypt, Jacob and his extended family were impacted. And so Jacob sends his sons without Benjamin to Egypt to buy food. And since Joseph was in charge of so many things, including selling grain, it was to Joseph to whom the brothers were sent. And although Joseph knew who his brothers were, they did not recognize him. Now I'm going to skip a lot of details, but we know that we know that the brothers minus one go back to Jacob. We know that the famine continues. We know that Jacob once again sends all the brothers back to Egypt. And it was on this second trip that Joseph revealed himself. And here's how it is stated from one version of the Bible. Once again, Joseph's brothers went to see him. Joseph could not hold himself any longer, keeping up a front before his attendants. And so he told his attendants to leave. And so there was no one with Joseph when he identified himself to his brothers, and he began to sob. And Joseph spoke to his brothers, I'm Joseph. Is my father still really alive? But his brothers were speechless. They couldn't believe what they were seeing and hearing. Come closer to me, Joseph said. They came closer. I am Joseph, your brother, to whom you sold into slavery. But don't feel badly. Don't blame yourselves for selling me. God was behind it. The famine will continue. So hurry back to my father. Tell him your son Joseph says, come as fast as you can with all of your family, and I will take care of you. And so Jacob and his extended family traveled to Egypt, where they lived out their years. Now, the story is certainly one about things like jealousy, betrayal, anger, family dynamics gone awry, God acting through a massive mess, restoration, reconciliation, hardship, and faith. But weaving throughout the story is power. Now, certainly it's a story about the power of God, but it's also a story about the human use and restraint of power. Joseph's brother used their power to rid themselves of their pain in the tail sibling. One of Pharaoh's assistants used his power to unfairly toss Joseph into prison. And while there are other uses and misuses of power, including Joseph messing a bit with his brother's heads, I skipped that part, the story, in fact, ends up being a magnificent illustration of what can happen when a person restrains his or her use of power. Indeed, there is beauty in restraint. Joseph, because of his position, could have easily engaged in deadly revenge against his brothers. Joseph could have used his power to harm his brothers in response to the fact they sold him into slavery. Joseph could have used his power in the Egyptian government, not for the benefit of the people, but for his own selfish gains. But instead, in the end of the story, Joseph restrained himself and his power. And a wonderful essay written by Rabbi Held writes, Joseph, in this story, models a different kind of greatness. He models the majesty of restraint. Now, God is all-powerful, we learn through Scripture. We are made in the image of God, and therefore, as we have power, we should use it only as God would have us use it, which means that we need to think about restraint. And because God is all-powerful, because God is in charge, because God brings good things out of bad, I believe we have the power to restrain our power. Joseph restrained himself, and because of his restraint, there was room for grace. There was room for forgiveness. There was room for humility. There was room for empathy. And ultimately, there was room for love. And so this morning, I think the life of Joseph and his story is an invitation for all of us to think about and to pray about those areas in our life to which we might be called to a position of restraint. Remembering all along that as followers of Jesus, we are following the one who used the most restraint of all. This is where this morning's reading from Philippians comes in. And here are some excerpts from a different version of the Bible. And the words are magnificent. Here's what Paul writes. If you've gotten anything at all out of following Christ, if his love has made any difference in your life, if being in community means anything to you, if you have a heart, if you care, then do me a favor. Agree with each other, love each other, be deep-spirited friends. Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet-talk your way to the top. Put yourself aside and help others get ahead. Don't be obsessed with getting your own advantage. Forget yourselves long enough to lend a helping hand. Think of yourselves in the way that Christ thought of himself. This is the important part with regard to restraint. Jesus had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. In fact, when the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave. It was an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death. And the worst kind of death at that, crucifixion. Jesus did not use the power that he had available to him. He exercised a very different kind of power, one that ended up being far more powerful, that changed the world. He exercised the power of astonishing restraint. Restraint is a very beautiful thing. And as I think about Joseph, as I think about Jesus, his humility, as I think about Paul's commission to each of us as followers of Jesus, I have to think, what would happen to our relationships with each other? What would happen to family dynamics? What would happen to neighborhoods? What would happen to the political scene in the United States? What would happen to so many problems around the world if we all learned and acted upon the beauty of a God-given restraint? You see, it is restraint, not power, that makes room for other people. It is restraint, not power, that makes room for grace. It is restraint, not power, that makes room for the love of God. The great philosopher and songwriter Jimi Hendrix understood this. Long ago he wrote, "When the power of love overcomes the love of power, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, it is then the world will know peace." And I'd have to add, it is then, my friends, that I believe that we will come to know the heart of God, for whom exercising love is always far more important than demonstrating